The staff of a high-end boutique thought they could humiliate a modestly dressed customer, but they had no idea how costly this mistake would cost them. Subscribe to find out more and write in the comments. Where are you watching this from? The soft glow of twilight began to settle over the city as Kieran Wilson stepped out of his penthouse, breathing in the cool evening air. The young billionaire preferred these quiet moments, times when he could escape the overwhelming responsibilities that came with managing a vast portfolio of investments and philanthropic projects. Despite the enormous wealth he had accumulated, Kieran avoided the ostentatious displays of luxury that often defined his peers. He wore a plain white t-shirt, dark jeans, and worn sneakers, a deliberate choice that reflected his desire to remain grounded. Strolling through one of the most prestigious neighborhoods in the city, Kieran felt a sense of calm. This part of the city thrived on exclusivity, with luxury boutiques, upscale restaurants, and private galleries lining the streets. But for Kieran, the allure of such wealth and status was secondary. What mattered to him was not the recognition but the quiet satisfaction of success. He wasn't chasing validation. His goals were personal, and each achievement marked a small victory against the expectations others had of him. The streets were peaceful, with only a few well-dressed couples enjoying the evening air, their conversations carried by the light breeze. As Kieran walked, he reflected on the recent project he had successfully completed, a complex deal that had required months of careful negotiation and strategic planning. The closing of that deal felt like more than just another business win. It was a testament to his perseverance. Tonight was meant to be a rare moment of self-indulgence, a chance to unwind and reflect on everything he had accomplished. As he turned the corner, the soft glow of a luxury watch boutique caught his attention. The store's immaculate glass windows showcased an array of watches that seemed more like works of art than mere timepieces. Among them, his eyes fell upon a watch that had captivated him for years. A limited edition model worth nearly $800,000. Its sleek design and precision engineering symbolized the kind of meticulous attention to detail that Kieran admired. He had come across this watch before, either in passing conversations or within the glossy pages of high-end magazines, but it was more than just another expensive accessory to him. It represented something deeper, a milestone. Owning it would not be a frivolous purchase, but a way to mark the completion of a chapter in his life. A way to remind himself that despite the challenges he faced, he had made it. Kieran stood outside the boutique for a moment, hands in his pockets, contemplating the watch through the glass. The boutique exuded an aura of exclusivity. The lighting inside was carefully curated, with warm spotlights illuminating the displays. Marble floors reflected the shimmer of gold and silver watches, and the scent of polished wood and leather lingered in the air. Every detail in the store seemed to scream sophistication and wealth. Yet, standing there in his casual attire, Kieran felt the first hint of unease, a subtle reminder that, despite his status, the way others perceived him was often dictated by superficial appearances. He knew that if he stepped inside, his worn sneakers and unassuming outfit would clash with the expectations of the store's elite clientele. But Kieran wasn't one to be deterred by such things. He had dealt with people judging him his entire life, and tonight he was determined not to let appearances stand in his way. Taking a deep breath, Kieran pushed open the glass door of the boutique. The soft chime that accompanied his entrance echoed through the near-empty space, drawing the attention of the store's staff. As he stepped inside, he was immediately struck by the contrast between the boutique's opulence and his own simplicity. The polished surfaces gleamed under the warm lights, and the soft hum of classical music played in the background. Kieran walked slowly, hands still in his pockets, taking in the carefully arranged displays of watches that lined the walls. He moved with the quiet confidence of someone used to navigate in spaces where he didn't always fit in, where the unspoken rules of power and privilege often clashed with reality. Yet, as he approached the display case holding the watch he had come to see, he couldn't help but notice the shift in the air, a subtle but palpable change in the way the staff regarded him. Behind the counter, two sales associates exchanged quick glances, their expressions flickering between curiosity and skepticism. Kieran caught the brief smirk that one of them failed to hide before turning away. It was a look he knew all too well, the kind that silently questioned what someone like him was doing in a place like this. Shrugging off the discomfort, Kieran leaned closer to the display, his eyes fixed on the watch. It was even more stunning in person, with its intricate detailing and flawless craftsmanship. He imagined it on his wrist, a reminder of everything he had accomplished. The thought brought a small, satisfied smile to his face, but the moment was fleeting. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw one of the associates approach, their demeanor carefully masked under a layer of professional politeness. "Good evening," the associate said, his voice smooth but with an undertone of suspicion. "Is there something I can help you with?" Kieran nodded, still gazing at the watch. "I'd like to see that one," he said, tapping the glass lightly where the limited edition timepiece rested. There was a brief pause, just long enough for the associate's smile to falter. His eyes flicked to Kieran's sneakers, and a flicker of doubt crossed his face. "That's a very exclusive piece," he said cautiously, as if testing the waters. "Not everyone can afford it." Kieran met the associate's gaze without flinching. "I understand," he replied calmly. "I still want to see it." The associate hesitated, glancing toward the other staff member for confirmation. There was a subtle exchange, a raised brow, a barely perceptible nod, and then the associate turned back to Kieran, his polite smile returning, though now tinged with something resembling condescension. "Of course," he said, reaching for the key to unlock the display. "But just so you know, it's priced at $800,000. Kieran didn't react. "I know," he said simply. The associate's smile tightened. "It's a lot of money," he added, as if Kieran needed reminding. "Perhaps I could show you something more. Affordable?" Kieran's patience was beginning to wear thin, but he kept his expression neutral. "I'd like to see that one," he repeated, his voice steady. The associate's smile didn't waver, but Kieran could see the irritation flicker in his eyes. With a small, almost imperceptible shrug, the associate unlocked the case and carefully lifted the watch from its velvet bed. He placed it on the counter between them, his hands lingering on it for a moment longer than necessary, as if reluctant to let it go. Kieran reached for the watch, his fingers brushing against the cool metal. It felt solid in his hand, a tangible reminder of everything he had overcome to get here. But even as he admired the craftsmanship, he could sense the weight of the associate's gaze on him, as if waiting for him to falter. This was not a simple transaction. It was a test. And Kieran knew that no matter what he did, he had already been judged. He returned the watch to the counter and straightened, meeting the associate's gaze head-on. "I'll take it," he said quietly, but with the kind of finality that left no room for doubt. The associate blinked, caught off guard. You'll take it?" he repeated, as if the words didn't quite make sense. Kieran nodded. "Yes, I'll take it." For a brief moment, the associate was too stunned to respond, But the shock quickly gave way to something else, a flicker of disbelief followed by the faintest hint of annoyance. And then, just like that, the polite mask was back in place, and the game continued. "Of course," the associate said smoothly. "I'll just need a moment to prepare the paperwork." Kieran gave a small nod and watched as the associate disappeared into the back room. The quiet hum of the boutique resumed, but the tension in the air remained. Kieran knew that this was only the beginning. As he stood there, waiting for the next step in this carefully orchestrated dance, he couldn't shake the feeling that the real challenge had yet to begin. The air inside the boutique felt heavier as Kieran remained by the counter, his calm demeanor unwavering. He leaned slightly, running his fingers across the glass case that held other luxurious timepieces, pretending not to notice the murmured conversations between the sales associates. However, their eyes betrayed their thoughts. Subtle glances cast toward him, fleeting expressions of disbelief, and a flicker of contempt. It was a look Kieran knew all too well, the unspoken judgment that he didn't belong in this world of indulgent opulence. The first sales associate who had greeted him earlier returned from the back, carefully placing a leather-bound booklet and a sleek pen on the counter. His demeanor was outwardly polite, but a tinge of sarcasm colored his every movement. Kieran could almost hear the silent question running through the man's mind. Is this guy for real? "Before we proceed with the purchase, sir," the associate said, flashing a practiced smile, "I'd like to remind you again of the watch's value, $800,000. He stressed the amount as if testing whether Kieran would flinch or show any hesitation. "It's not exactly a casual buy." Kieran kept his expression steady. "I understand," he responded, his voice measured. The associate's smile faltered slightly, but he recovered quickly, scribbling notes into the booklet. It was clear that every moment Kieran remained in the boutique, the tension thickened, feeding into the unspoken belief that his presence was an anomaly. Behind the associate, another staff member whispered something to the manager, a tall, stern-faced woman with sharp features and an air of practiced authority. Kieran noticed how her eyes flicked toward him, narrowing slightly before she gave the slightest nod. The first associate glanced back at her, a smug expression briefly crossing his face as if receiving silent approval. The manager approached with slow, deliberate steps. Her black pumps clicked against the marble floor and her dark business suit was perfectly tailored. She gave Kieran the kind of smile reserved for unwelcome guests, polite, thin-lipped, and dripping with skepticism. "Sir," she said, folding her hands in front of her, "I just wanted to ensure that there's no misunderstanding." Kieran turned to meet her gaze, his dark eyes calm but unyielding. "There isn't," he said evenly. "I know exactly what I'm buying." The manager's smile grew tighter, her patience clearly thinning. "We don't typically see customers making such purchases without, some preparation." Her tone was carefully modulated, teetering on the edge of condescension. The implication in her words was clear. "What are you even doing here?" Kieran felt the familiar surge of irritation rise within him but forced it down, masking it behind his usual calm exterior. He had been through worse encounters, moments when his entire identity was reduced to someone else's assumptions. This was no different. Yet tonight, the weight of these microaggressions felt heavier than usual. Perhaps because tonight was supposed to mark a celebration, not another reminder of society's narrow perceptions. "I came to make a purchase," Kieran said, his voice unwavering. "I'd appreciate it if you'd let me." The manager gave a small, almost imperceptible shrug. "Of course, sir." she replied with forced politeness, her gaze sweeping over him again, searching for anything that might align with the image she expected. But Kieran gave her nothing. The discomfort in the room was palpable. As the associate continued to fill out the paperwork, he shot another glance at the manager, who gave a slight nod. The signal was clear. A silent decision had been made. The associate stepped back from the counter and made a discreet gesture toward the security guard stationed by the door. The guard, a burly man with broad shoulders and a permanent scowl, nodded once and began to move. His heavy steps echoed against the marble floor as he made his way toward Kieran, positioning himself just a little too close, as if anticipating trouble. Kieran noticed the shift immediately. The guard's posture was rigid, his expression stern, a silent warning that any wrong move would not be tolerated. Kieran could feel the heat of the man's gaze on the back of his neck, the unspoken message clear. "We're watching you." He exhaled slowly, keeping his focus on the watch in front of him, his hands resting calmly on the glass counter. He knew what they were doing. They were waiting for him to give them a reason, any reason, to justify their suspicions. A raised voice, a frustrated gesture, a misplaced word. They were ready to pounce. The manager stood nearby, watching the scene unfold with a faint, satisfied smirk, as if she had already won some unspoken contest. Kieran remained still. He wouldn't give them the satisfaction. "I'll need your ID for the paperwork," the associate said smoothly, his voice carrying the thin veneer of civility. Kieran reached into his back pocket and pulled out his wallet. As he handed over his ID, he noticed the slight twitch in the associate's expression, a flicker of surprise, quickly masked. "Thank you," the associate muttered, taking the card and glancing at it briefly before handing it back. For a moment, Kieran thought the encounter might end there, but the guard shifted closer, his presence looming. "Is everything all right here?" the guard asked, his tone suggesting that he was hoping the answer would be no. The manager folded her arms, tilting her head slightly. "We're just being cautious," she said lightly, as if to excuse the guard's behavior. Kieran gave a small, tight smile. "Of course," he said softly, but the edge in his voice was unmistakable. "I wouldn't want anyone to feel uncomfortable." The words hung in the air, sharp and deliberate. For a brief moment, no one spoke. The manager's smile faltered slightly, but she quickly recovered. The associate cleared his throat and returned to the paperwork, his pen moving quickly over the forms. As Kieran stood there, waiting for the transaction to be completed, he felt the weight of every stare in the room. They saw him not as a client, but as an intruder, someone who didn't belong in their world. And yet, Kieran knew better than to walk away. He had faced these moments before. Moments when society tried to remind him of the spaces he wasn't meant to occupy. But each time, he had stayed. Not out of spite, but because leaving would mean surrendering to the narrow definitions others placed upon him. And Kieran Wilson never surrendered. The guard shifted slightly, his presence still looming, but Kieran ignored him. Instead, he kept his focus on the associate, who scribbled the final details into the paperwork with unnecessary flourish. "There we are," the associate said finally, handing Kieran the pen. "Just need your signature." Kieran took the pen without a word, scrawling his name across the dotted line. As he handed the pen back, the associate gave a strained smile. "Enjoy your purchase," he said, though the words felt more like a dismissal than a sincere wish. Kieran met the man's gaze one last time, his own expression unreadable. "Thank you," he replied, his voice calm but laced with an unspoken promise. The transaction was complete, but the real game was only beginning. The transaction had barely concluded when the boutique's atmosphere shifted from thinly veiled disdain to outright hostility. Kieran could feel the tension deepening, as if the room itself were closing in on him. As he prepared to leave with his newly purchased watch, the manager exchanged a knowing glance with the security guard. It was a glance heavy with intention. "We need to teach him a lesson." Before Kieran could take a step toward the door, the guard intervened. "Hold on a second," the guard barked, his voice loud enough to draw attention from the scattered customers in the store. "I need to see some more ID, just to verify." Kieran stopped in his tracks, his jaw tightening, but he kept his composure. He slowly turned, knowing full well that this was more than just a formality. They weren't verifying anything. They were trying to put him in his place. "I've already shown my ID," Kieran replied evenly, holding the bag with the expensive watch at his side. "The purchase is complete." The manager, standing smugly behind the counter, crossed her arms. "Just a routine security measure, sir. You understand, of course. With items this valuable, we have to be extra cautious." The passive-aggressive smile on her face made it clear that the humiliation was deliberate. It wasn't enough that Kieran had bought the watch. They needed to undermine him, strip him of dignity in front of everyone. Kieran could feel the eyes of the other customers locking on to him, their whispered conversations growing louder. A few had gathered closer to see what the commotion was about, some pulling out their phones to record. The black guy in the luxury store getting questioned by security, something worth capturing. The guard stepped closer, his stance widening as if preparing for a confrontation. "You mind if I check the bag?" he asked, though it wasn't really a question. Kieran's nostrils flared slightly, but he handed over the bag without a word. The guard rummaged through it, taking his time, his large hands deliberately fumbling with the delicate packaging. When he finally pulled out the watch, he inspected it as if it were contraband, holding it up for everyone to see. "Just making sure it's not stolen," the guard muttered with a smirk. A ripple of laughter moved through the boutique, low and malicious. The manager leaned in closer, addressing Kieran in a voice dripping with condescension. "It's not often we get walk-ins purchasing such high-ticket items. We have to make sure everything's in order." Kieran stared at her for a long moment, his face calm but his eyes smoldering with quiet fury. He had dealt with this kind of treatment before, this unspoken, insidious racism masked as policy. But the public spectacle they were making of him now was something else entirely. It was no longer just about questioning his wealth or status. It was about putting him in his place, reminding him of where they thought he belonged. The situation escalated further when the manager made a show of pulling out her phone. "I think we need to call the police," she said loudly, casting a glance at the customers gathered around. "Just a precaution. Better safe than sorry." The crowd buzzed with excitement, the prospect of police involvement adding an extra layer of entertainment to the unfolding drama. Kieran could hear the murmurs spreading through the group of onlookers, snippets of judgment passed among strangers who didn't know him but were eager to draw conclusions. "Looks suspicious to me," someone whispered. "Probably a scam," another added, their voice tinged with amusement. Kieran stood still, forcing his breathing to remain even, but every muscle in his body tensed with restrained anger. The humiliation was relentless, and it was becoming clear that this wouldn't end with just a few snide remarks or a bag check. Minutes later, the sound of approaching sirens pierced the air, growing louder as the police arrived. Kieran knew this moment would come the second the manager made her decision. Two uniformed officers entered the store, their expressions stern and professional, though Kieran could see the flicker of assumptions playing across their faces as they scanned the scene. One officer, a middle-aged man with a hardened look, took the lead. His gaze landed on Kieran, and it was as if the man had already decided he was guilty of something. "Step outside, sir," the officer ordered, gesturing toward the boutique entrance. His tone was sharp, commanding, more of a demand than a request. Kieran knew arguing wouldn't help. He exhaled slowly, clenching his jaw as he walked toward the door, with the officers trailing closely behind him. The crowd of customers followed, spilling out onto the sidewalk, eager to witness whatever would happen next. Outside, under the cold glow of the streetlights, Kieran was instructed to stand against the wall. The officer in charge gave him a once-over, clearly unimpressed by his casual attire. "We've had a report about some suspicious activity," the officer said flatly. "I'm going to need to see some identification." Kieran pulled out his ID once again, handing it over without a word. The officer glanced at it briefly, but the scrutiny in his eyes lingered, as if searching for something that would confirm whatever bias had already formed in his mind. Behind the officers, the manager of the boutique stood with her arms folded, watching with a satisfied expression. She gave a small nod to the officer, silently reinforcing her accusations. The officer handed the ID back to Kieran with a slight sneer. "Mind if we do a quick search? Just to be thorough." Kieran knew he had little choice. Resisting would only escalate the situation further. He raised his arm slightly, offering no resistance as the officers began to pat him down. The search was invasive, every touch a deliberate reminder of his perceived inferiority. The crowd murmured in approval, phones still recording the scene. This was what they had come for. The spectacle of a black man being treated like a criminal in an affluent neighborhood. The officer finished the search and stepped back, looking annoyed that he hadn't found anything incriminating. "And what's in the bag?" he asked, though he already knew. Kieran gave a tight smile. "A watch," he said, his voice steady. "A watch I just bought. You can ask the store if you have any doubts." The officer glanced toward the manager, who gave a small shrug as if to say, "It's your call." For a moment, the officer seemed to consider pushing the situation further. But then, with a reluctant sigh, he handed the bag back to Kieran. "All right," the officer muttered. "But next time, try not to attract attention." The words were meant as a dismissal, but they landed with the weight of an insult. Kieran took the bag without comment, knowing that anything he said now would only prolong the ordeal. The crowd began to disperse, disappointed that the confrontation hadn't ended with handcuffs or an arrest. The officers lingered for a moment longer before turning and heading back to their patrol car, leaving Kieran standing alone on the sidewalk, the bag with the watch clutched in his hand. The manager and staff from the boutique retreated back into the store, exchanging smug smiles. To them, this was just another incident. One they would forget by tomorrow, perhaps even laugh about over drinks. But for Kieran, this was far from over. As he stood there, watching the boutique staff disappear inside, the anger that had simmered beneath his calm exterior began to boil over. He had endured the humiliation, the judgment, the public spectacle. But he wouldn't let it end here. This was the moment he realized that it wasn't enough to buy a watch to mark the end of a chapter. This was the beginning of something new, a reckoning that would reshape everything. With a quiet, determined breath, Kieran turned on his heel and walked away from the boutique, the watch heavy in his hand, and an even heavier resolve settling in his chest. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The door to Kieran's penthouse clicked shut behind him as he stepped into the familiar quiet of his home, though tonight the silence felt suffocating. He placed the watch carefully on the sleek black counter in the open concept kitchen, its weight a bitter reminder of the night's events. For a moment, he stood still, staring at the timepiece. This was supposed to symbolize the end of one chapter in his life, a reward for his perseverance. But now it stood for something entirely different: injustice. Kieran exhaled slowly, leaning on the counter, letting the emotions he had suppressed during the confrontation rise to the surface. His heart still thumped with the frustration and anger that had simmered beneath his calm exterior throughout the night. He thought back to every cutting glance, every snide comment, the humiliation of being searched on a public street like a criminal. He had endured this kind of treatment before, but tonight had pushed him past a threshold. There were only so many indignities a man could swallow before deciding enough was enough. Kieran clenched his jaw, staring at the watch with narrowed eyes. They didn't just insult me, they insulted everything I've built, everything I stand for. This wouldn't be another incident to brush off, another story to tell with a bitter laugh over drinks. No, tonight was a turning point. The boutique staff had made a mistake, one they couldn't afford, and Kieran intended to make sure they paid for it. He reached for his phone, pulling up his contact list. It didn't take long to find the people he needed: his legal team, his financial advisors, and his most trusted business associates. These were the people who had helped him navigate some of the most complicated deals of his career. And tonight, they would help him with something more personal. Within minutes, Kieran had initiated a series of video calls. His kitchen became a war room, the soft glow from his laptop illuminating his determined expression. On the other end of the line, his team listened intently as he described the events at the boutique, laying out the night's humiliation in careful, factual detail. There was no need to exaggerate. The truth was damning enough. His head legal advisor, a sharp-eyed woman named Dana, shook her head in disbelief. "Unbelievable," she muttered. "They really thought they could get away with this?" Kieran's expression hardened. "They always do, but this time they won't." Dana leaned forward on her screen, her eyes narrowing. "What's the plan, Kieran? You're not just looking for a public apology, are you?" A small, humorless smile tugged at the corner of Kieran's mouth. "Not even close," he replied. "I want the whole network of boutiques." There was a brief silence on the call as his team processed the audacity of his plan. One of his financial advisors, Mark, cleared his throat. "You want to buy them out?" "Yes," Kieran said firmly. "Every store, every asset. I want full control." Mark's eyebrows shot up. "That's a bold move. We're talking millions in acquisition costs." Kieran's gaze didn't waver. "I can afford it, and they can't afford not to sell." Dana tapped her pen thoughtfully against her notebook. "We'd need leverage, something to convince the owners to sell quickly and quietly." Kieran gave a sharp nod. "That's why we're not just buying the stores, we're going to expose them. I want every piece of evidence from tonight. Security footage, witness statements, everything." He turned to another team member, a media strategist named Carla. "Can we make this public without compromising our negotiation position?" Carla's eyes sparkled with excitement. "Absolutely. We leak just enough to build pressure, make it clear that their reputation is on the line. By the time we're done, they'll be begging you to take the company off their hands." Dana smirked. "A hostile takeover with a side of social justice. I like it." Kieran leaned back slightly, feeling the first glimmer of satisfaction since the night began. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about reshaping the system that allowed this kind of behavior to persist. "We're going to hit them where it hurts," Kieran said, his voice steady and resolute, "in their wallets and in the court of public opinion." The team spent the next hour strategizing, each member laying out their part in the plan. Carla would coordinate with influential media contacts to ensure the story gained traction. Dana would prepare the legal framework for the acquisition and any potential lawsuits. Mark and the financial team would analyze the boutique's assets, looking for vulnerabilities. It didn't take long for the first cracks to appear. By the end of the meeting, Mark had discovered that the boutique network was already on shaky ground. The luxury watch industry had been struggling, and the boutique's parent company was facing mounting financial pressure. They were on the verge of putting several locations up for sale. Kieran smiled to himself. Perfect timing. The next step was to gather the evidence from the incident. Dana arranged for a private investigator to secure copies of the boutique's security footage and any witness statements. Carla began crafting a narrative that would frame the story in a way that resonated with the public. A story about a successful black entrepreneur being humiliated by outdated prejudices. Kieran knew that once the story went public, it would explode. This was a moment that captured the zeitgeist, a perfect storm of wealth, race, and injustice. It would be impossible to ignore, and the boutique's management would have no choice but to respond. But Kieran wasn't just interested in headlines, he wanted change, and he intended to start by reshaping the boutique network from the ground up. "Once we take control," Kieran said toward the end of the call, "we're going to clean house. Every employee involved in tonight's incident, gone, and after that, we introduce mandatory inclusivity training across the entire network." Dana nodded approvingly. "That'll send a message." Kieran leaned forward, his gaze steady. "This isn't just about sending a message. It's about setting a precedent. I want these people to understand that actions have consequences." The meeting concluded, and Kieran sat back, feeling a sense of calm return. He had a plan. A solid, ruthless plan. And by the time he was done, the people who had tried to humiliate him would wish they had never crossed his path. As the night deepened outside his penthouse windows, Kieran rose from his seat and walked back to the counter, where the watch still lay in its elegant packaging. He opened the box and carefully lifted the timepiece, letting the cool metal rest in his hand. The watch no longer felt like a reward. It was a symbol of unfinished business. Sliding it onto his wrist, Kieran felt a renewed sense of purpose settle over him. The boutique staff had tried to make him feel small, insignificant, but they didn't realize who they were dealing with. With one last glance at the glittering cityscape beyond the windows, Kieran made a silent promise to himself. By the time he was done, they would. The next few days would be crucial, and Kieran Wilson was ready for whatever came next. The next morning arrived quietly, but for Kieran, it marked the beginning of a calculated campaign. He woke early, his mind sharp and focused, as the final pieces of his strategy began falling into place. Over the past 48 hours, his team had worked tirelessly, gathering every scrap of evidence, analyzing the boutique network's financials, and planting seeds in the media. Now it was time to move from planning to execution. Kieran stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse, sipping a black coffee as the city came to life below him. His phone buzzed with a series of notifications, updates from Dana and Carla, as well as financial summaries from Mark. Everything was in place. He had the leverage he needed, and now it was time to make his move. Later that afternoon, Kieran arrived at an upscale private office building where the meeting with the boutique network's owners had been scheduled. Dressed in a tailored navy suit that accentuated his commanding presence, he looked every bit the powerful investor he was. This time, there would be no casual clothes to give anyone reason to doubt him. The building's sleek interior matched the exclusivity of the boutiques: polished marble floors, minimalist decor, and high-end art lining the walls. Kieran stepped into the conference room with an air of quiet confidence, taking note of the owners seated around the long glass table. The principal owner, a graying man named William Hadley, rose from his seat with a carefully crafted smile. His handshake was firm, but Kieran sensed the underlying nerves behind his professional demeanor. Hadley's boutique network was struggling, and Kieran had chosen the perfect moment to strike. "Mr. Wilson, we appreciate you meeting with us on such short notice," Hadley said, gesturing for Kieran to take a seat. Kieran nodded politely as he settled into a chair, his expression composed but unreadable. "I appreciate the opportunity to discuss a potential acquisition," he said smoothly. "I understand your company has been experiencing some financial difficulties." Hadley's smile tightened ever so slightly, but he kept his composure. "We've hit a few bumps, yes. The market has been challenging, but we're exploring options." Kieran leaned back in his chair, his eyes sharp and calculating. "I'm here to offer a solution. I'm prepared to acquire your entire network of boutiques at a fair price, one that will allow you to walk away without further losses." The other owners exchanged uneasy glances, sensing there was more to Kieran's proposal than he was letting on. They knew they were in no position to reject an offer outright, but they needed to understand his angle. Hadley cleared his throat. "Mr. Wilson, while we appreciate your interest, these kinds of acquisitions usually take time. We'd need to evaluate the terms and consider other buyers." Kieran smiled, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "I believe you'll find my offer compelling enough to act quickly." He reached into his briefcase, pulling out a slim folder that contained the legal documentation prepared by Dana. "This acquisition comes with a few non-negotiable conditions." Hadley raised an eyebrow, glancing at the folder. "And those would be?" Kieran's tone remained calm, but there was a steely edge beneath it. "All employees involved in a recent incident at one of your boutiques will be immediately terminated." The tension in the room grew palpable. Hadley's expression shifted, his polite facade cracking slightly. "What incident, exactly?" Kieran held his gaze unwavering. "A public incident involving me in one of your stores. I believe your manager called the police on a legitimate customer." Hadley's eyes flickered with recognition, and Kieran saw the realization dawn on him. The owners exchanged nervous glances as the weight of the situation began to sink in. They had insulted the wrong man. Kieran let the silence stretch for a moment longer, allowing the full impact of his words to settle over the room. Then, with deliberate calm, he placed his phone on the table and tapped the screen. A video began playing, the security footage from the boutique. It showed the entire incident. The sneers, the insults, the arrival of the police, and the public search. The owners watched in stunned silence as the humiliating scene unfolded before them. Kieran's calm demeanor throughout the ordeal only made their employees' behavior appear more disgraceful. When the video ended, Kieran looked directly at Hadley. "This footage is circulating as we speak. I've already shared it with a few trusted media contacts." Hadley paled, his hands tightening around the edge of the table. This could destroy our reputation, he whispered, more to himself than anyone else. Kieran leaned forward slightly, his gaze unwavering. It will, unless you agree to my terms. Sell me the network and I'll ensure the transition is handled quietly. Refuse, and the public fallout will be catastrophic. One of the other owners, a middle-aged woman with carefully styled hair, cleared her throat nervously. Mr. Wilson, surely we can come to an arrangement that doesn't involve drastic measures. Kieran's expression remained cool. This is the arrangement, he said simply. You sell, or your brand goes down in flames. Hadley exchanged desperate glances with his partners, weighing their options. They knew they were cornered. The boutique network couldn't withstand a scandal of this magnitude, and the financial strain they were already under made Kieran's offer too tempting to refuse. After a long, tense silence, Hadley exhaled deeply and gave a reluctant nod. We'll accept your terms. The rest of the meeting proceeded swiftly. Kieran's legal team had anticipated every possible delay, ensuring the documents were airtight. Within an hour, the papers were signed, and Kieran Wilson became the new owner of the luxury boutique network. As the owners slumped in their chairs, defeated and deflated, Kieran rose gracefully from his seat. He extended his hand to Hadley, though there was no warmth in the gesture. A pleasure doing business with you. Hadley shook his hand reluctantly, knowing there was nothing pleasurable about this transaction. What happens now? Kieran gave a small, knowing smile. Now we rebuild. The acquisition marked more than just a change of ownership. It was the beginning of a transformation. Kieran didn't buy the boutique network to run it the way it had always been run. He intended to tear down the toxic culture that had led to the incident in the first place and build something new in its place. Within hours of the deal's conclusion, Kieran's team began implementing the first wave of changes. The employees involved in the incident were terminated, and their replacements underwent rigorous training in inclusivity and customer service. Kieran also announced a new initiative. A portion of the network's profits would be allocated to support underrepresented entrepreneurs and designers, fostering a new generation of talent in the luxury industry. As Kieran left the office building that evening, the weight of the night's events lifted slightly from his shoulders. He had done more than just buy a company. He had reclaimed his dignity and turned an insult into an opportunity. He glanced at the elegant watch on his wrist, the same one that had symbolized so much frustration and anger just days ago. Now it represented something far greater: victory. And Kieran Wilson wasn't finished yet. This was only the beginning. The sun was high over the city as Kieran Wilson stepped out of his car, the deep hum of the luxury engine cutting off behind him. He adjusted the cuffs of his tailored charcoal suit, glancing briefly at the boutique across the street, the very one where his humiliation had played out a few nights ago. But today, things were different. Today, he wasn't just another customer stepping into a hostile space. Today, he was the owner. Behind him, a small entourage of security guards followed closely, their presence silent but imposing. A few journalists lingered near the entrance, alerted to the news of the recent acquisition. Kieran's team had planned it perfectly, giving the press just enough time to arrive, ensuring the moment would be captured and shared widely. He crossed the street with measured, deliberate steps, the heels of his shoes clicking sharply against the pavement. Pedestrians slowed as they recognized him, their eyes widening in surprise. It didn't take long for whispers to spread. That's him. That's the guy from the video. The media frenzy surrounding the incident had reached every corner of the city by now, making Kieran's return to the boutique an event people couldn't ignore. When Kieran reached the glass doors, he paused briefly, letting the tension build. He could see the boutique staff inside, their faces pale and nervous. The manager, the same woman who had called the police on him, stood frozen behind the counter. Her once confident demeanor had crumbled, replaced with visible panic. She knew what was coming. Kieran pushed open the door with a calm, controlled motion, the soft chime of the bell cutting through the thick silence inside the boutique. The journalists pressed closer to the windows, their cameras ready to capture every moment. The manager's eyes darted between Kieran and the security guards, her face a mixture of confusion and dread. "Mr. Wilson," she stammered, forcing a shaky smile. What brings you back here?" Kieran took his time, letting the weight of the moment sink in. He glanced around the store, his gaze lingering on the marble floors, the glass displays, the very spot where he had stood during his public humiliation. The memory of that night was still fresh, but today it carried no sting, only a cold satisfaction. He turned back to the manager, his expression calm but unyielding. "I came to see my store," he said simply, his voice carrying an edge of finality. The manager blinked, confused. "Your store?" Kieran gave a small, deliberate smile. "Yes," he replied, enjoying the way the word unsettled her. "As of this morning, this boutique, and every other one in the network, belongs to me." The manager's face drained of color, her mouth opening and closing in stunned silence. The other employees stood rigid, their expressions mirroring her disbelief. It was a moment Kieran had imagined countless times over the past few days, and now that it was here, it felt even better than he had anticipated. "I assume you've heard about the ownership change?" Kieran asked, though it was clear from her expression that she had. "Yes," the manager whispered, her voice barely audible. "But we didn't know you were—" "That's right," Kieran interrupted, his tone cutting through her excuses. "I'm the new owner." The journalists outside leaned in closer, cameras flashing as they documented every second of the confrontation. Kieran let the silence linger for a moment longer before delivering the final blow. "As of today," he continued, "all employees involved in the incident last week are terminated, effective immediately." The manager's eyes widened in disbelief. "But, sir—" "There are no buts," Kieran said coldly. "You humiliated a paying customer, called the police on him, and subjected him to a public search for no reason other than your own prejudice. There is no place for people like you in this company." The manager tried to stammer a defense, but Kieran raised a hand, silencing her. "Your employment ends now. You have 10 minutes to collect your things and leave." Her face crumpled, but she knew there was no room for negotiation. The other employees shuffled nervously, avoiding eye contact with Kieran as the weight of the situation settled over them. Kieran turned to the security guards accompanying him. "Ensure that she and anyone else involved leave immediately," he instructed, "and let the remaining staff know that inclusivity training begins tomorrow." The guards gave a curt nod and moved to escort the disgraced employees out. The manager's protests were feeble and quickly drowned out by the sound of cameras clicking and the buzz of murmurs from onlookers outside. With the situation under control, Kieran turned his attention back to the reason he had come. He walked slowly to the glass display where the limited edition watch sat. The same one he had bought days earlier, the purchase that had sparked this entire chain of events. He opened the display case himself, lifting the watch from its velvet pedestal and fastening it around his wrist. The weight of the timepiece felt different now, not just a reminder of personal success, but a symbol of triumph over injustice. Kieran looked down at the watch, admiring the way it caught the light. Then, with deliberate calm, he turned to face the journalists outside the boutique. The cameras clicked in rapid succession, capturing the moment. The victorious return of a man who had refused to be humiliated. He gave the photographers a small, satisfied smile before addressing the remaining employees. "This store will be different," he said quietly but firmly. "From now on, every customer who walks through these doors will be treated with respect. No exceptions." The staff nodded quickly, eager to show they understood. Kieran could see the fear in their eyes, but he didn't care. Fear was a powerful motivator, and he intended to use it to ensure that no one else endured what he had experienced. Satisfied, Kieran adjusted the cuffs of his suit and gave one last glance around the boutique. The marble floors, the glittering displays, the soft hum of luxury, they all felt different now. This place was his, and it would serve as a reminder to anyone who doubted him that actions had consequences. Without another word, Kieran turned and walked toward the exit, the journalists parting to make way for him. As he stepped out onto the sidewalk, the sun shining down on his back, he knew this was more than just a victory. It was justice, and it was only the beginning of the change he intended to bring. In the following weeks, Kieran's transformation of the boutique network began in earnest. The restructuring was swift and deliberate, setting an example not just for the company but for the entire luxury retail industry. Word of the takeover spread like wildfire, and soon every media outlet was covering the story of the billionaire who bought out the very stores that had humiliated him and vowed to change them forever. Kieran's first move was to implement comprehensive diversity and inclusivity training across all stores in the network. His team developed programs designed to foster empathy, cultural awareness, and accountability. Every employee, whether new or tenured, had to undergo the training, ensuring that the toxic culture of exclusion was eradicated from the ground up. Simultaneously, Kieran launched an initiative to partner with young, underrepresented designers from diverse backgrounds. The boutiques, once known for catering to a narrow, elite clientele, were now platforms for new voices and innovative designs. This wasn't just about selling luxury products anymore. It was about creating a brand that reflected inclusion and empowerment. Kieran also committed a portion of the company's profits to support entrepreneurs of color, establishing grants and mentorship programs for aspiring business owners. Through these efforts, he aimed to address the systemic challenges he had encountered in his own career and open doors for others who had been shut out of the industry. The move was widely praised, with industry leaders and social activists alike applauding Kieran's efforts to turn a personal slight into meaningful change. The boutiques began to attract a new clientele, one that appreciated both the quality of the products and the values the brand now represented. As the story of Kieran's transformation of the boutiques gained momentum, it became a viral sensation. Social media platforms buzzed with praise for his leadership and his refusal to tolerate discrimination. The hashtag #LuxuryForAll trended for weeks, with people sharing their own stories of overcoming prejudice and celebrating Kieran's example. The press coverage was relentless, but this time the spotlight was welcome. Kieran used the attention strategically, not for personal gain, but to draw focus to the broader issues of equity and fairness in the luxury industry. Luxury is not just about wealth, Kieran stated in a televised interview. It's about respect. Respect for people, regardless of how they look, what they wear, or where they come from. That's the legacy I intend to build." His words resonated, and soon other companies followed his lead, introducing similar inclusivity programs and partnerships with diverse designers. Kieran's actions had sparked a movement. Several months after the acquisition, Kieran found himself once again in the neighborhood where the humiliating incident had taken place. He sat at an outdoor cafe, sipping espresso, watching the world pass by. Across the street, the boutique he now owned buzzed with activity. Customers of all backgrounds browsed the displays, greeted warmly by the new staff Kieran had carefully selected. The sight filled him with quiet satisfaction. The boutique was no longer a symbol of exclusion. It had become a beacon of change, just as he had intended. Kieran glanced at his wrist, admiring the limited edition watch that had sparked the entire journey. It was more than just an accessory now. It was a reminder that no challenge was insurmountable, no slight too small to ignore, and no injustice beyond correction. He thought back to that night in the boutique, how small they had tried to make him feel, how determined they were to keep him out of their world. And now here he was, not only a part of that world, but reshaping it in his image. The quiet triumph tasted sweeter than any public applause ever could. Kieran knew this was just the beginning. There were still barriers to break, industries to disrupt, and systems to challenge. But if there was one thing he had learned through this experience, it was that change didn't happen by waiting. It happened by doing. He finished his espresso, leaving a generous tip on the table, and stood. As he adjusted the cuff of his suit, he glanced one last time at the boutique across the street. The transformation was real, but it wasn't just about a building, a brand, or even a business. It was about legacy, the kind of legacy that didn't just accumulate wealth, but built bridges, opened doors, and redefined what was possible. With the sun warm on his back and the weight of the watch comfortable on his wrist, Kieran walked away from the cafe, already planning his next venture. Because for Kieran Wilson, victory wasn't a destination, it was a way of life. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button, because you don't want to miss what's coming next. More powerful stories are on the way. Check out our other videos and let us know in the comments. Where are you watching this from? Your support helps us keep sharing these stories. See you in the next one.